Okay, one of the things to keep in mind, I think that really this essay is very valuable in doing, and in trying to understand what they're getting at, especially with the Parfit examples and their own example at the end, is what they remind us of is that we are temporal creatures. That is, okay, here's this line again, which I've adjusted a little bit, but the adjustments were meant to introduce the idea that we live in time, that, okay, let's just say that we live on that lifeline with those brackets on the left and the right with birth and death. We don't live it all at once, right? We live it moment by moment, and we live it in time, and at any moment in that time, we have, part of that line has been traveled and part of it hasn't. And the part that has been traveled is our past. And the part that hasn't been traveled is our future. And we are always at one point, that point that divides them. And it may be too schematic a way of representing human experience of time, but it is at least plausible. And it helps us to kind of see that maybe the Epicureans leave something out. At least that's what Bruckner and Fisher would say. This reality that we live in between the past and the future, that we have a past and we have a future, does shape in a fundamental way how we value things. We are oriented towards the future. And so let's think of how that affects our evaluation of the relative worth of goods and the relative badness of bads. The key to the first example, where Parfit imagines that you wake up in a hospital bed not knowing whether you have had a very painful operation that lasted 10 hours or you will have a very painful operation that lasts 1 hour. The whole point of that is to show that we want to have our bads in the past. That even if we're choosing, let's say, about which we would rather have, 10 hours of suffering or 1 hour of suffering, we would choose the 10 hours of suffering as long as it was in our past rather than our future, which is really kind of a very striking argument or striking observation that does seem to jibe with our intuitions about things. We want the bad things of life, we would rather have them in the past than have them in the future. We regard them, we give them different values. And one can see that already this suggests a kind of solution to the asymmetry problem. Because if we consider posthumous non-existence and prenatal non-existence both to be bads, one clearly is in our past, our prenatal non-existence, and one is in our future, our posthumous non-existence. So the argument could, and this turns out not to be the real argument, but the argument could be something like this. Well, if we think that it's rational, that is, if we accept it as a tenet of human rationality, that it's better to have your bads in the past than in the future, then clearly regarding posthumous non-existence as being worse than prenatal non-existence is fully irrational, because it's just what we do. If it's rational to want your bads in the past rather than the future, then it's rational to regard posthumous non-existence, which is bads in the future, as being worse, at least, than prenatal non-existence. This turns out not to be because of difficulties having to do with different types of bad and whether they're experienced or not. This turns out not to be the full solution, but at least it kind of points you in a certain way and is key to coming up with their solution. So, yeah, you should get that, right? That is that the introduction of the time aspect, the temporal aspect, and the observation that the temporal location of our bads in life means a lot to us. They're worse if they're in the future than if they're in our past. It would seem to be quite relevant to the asymmetry problem. Now, then the question is, why doesn't it go ahead and solve the asymmetry problem? And that is going to probably have to do one more essay where we talk about, the difference between experienced bads and unexperienced bads, and how the difference between those means that we need to have a different sort of solution to these simple.